I thought the documentary was fascinating, and that it really caught the human side of the press corps with all of the fatigue and all of the hunger and everything else, and it really gave you a great sense of it. I want just very quickly to explore two intellectual arguments that were made, particularly immediately after Tiananmen, in critique of the press corps, because I would think that there's more to be considered. I find the arguments a little bit off base, and they're touched on in the documentary. The first is that the press was somehow unrealistic in covering the demonstrations, that it imposed unrealistic expectations on what could happen. And I know where that comes from. I mean, one of my favorite books of all time about China is Jonathan Spence, the Yale historian's. One of his earliest books is called To Change China. And it's a series of essays and portraits of all the people who came from outside China to try and change it, starting with the missionaries, and who ended up frustrated. And the point really gets nailed home in just about the last chapter is about the Soviet agent Borodin coming to China to make a good communist country and going home absolutely as frustrated as the missionaries. So yes, Westerners impose expectations on China. It's the unrealistic part bothers me, and I'd like you to think a little bit more about it, because that is saying it's judging by what, with retrospectively in knowing what happened. The rules were being defined then. To say that this was unrealistic, to take a modern analog that's very current, would be to say that it's unrealistic to think that Russia would ever allow the Crimea to be ruled by a Ukrainian government that wasn't controlled by Moscow. I mean, the rules are being defined at the time, and in the case of China and Tiananmen, it wasn't just the press or Americans or Westerners who were saying, wasn't sure how this was going to come out. There was conventional wisdom that came directly from the Chinese people, that the Chinese army, the People's Liberation Army, never uses force against its own people. The party was divided right up to the top until very near the end. And one of the things you don't see, because it would be too boring in the movie, in the documentary, there's a gap. The party the martial law is declared, and the troops start into downtown Beijing, and they stop. That's in the document. And then there's a week. And in that week is what it takes for Deng Xiaoping to make sure that he can pull this off. So the idea that it was unrealistic, I think, is not quite right. If you took a poll of the press corps of all the people there and you asked how many of them thought that this was going to end up in a Jeffersonian democracy, you would have found zero, I think. The second is the CNN effect. And you heard Bernie Shaw mention the CNN effect. And again, I understand that argument. There was a CNN effect. I could talk more about the limits of it. But what you don't see, the argument goes that TV exaggerated things, and that somehow the American public was aroused because by the presence of the cameras, because it was all on television. And what you need to think twice about is actually the premise is wrong. It wasn't all on television. In fact, the heart of what happened took place. You heard John Pomfret in the documentary refer to being at Mushidi. The cameras were not. The heart of what happened that night was that the military opened fire, particularly at Mushidi and places like that. None of that is on camera, okay? So if there were cameras there, if they had been by chance at a hotel on the west side of Beijing, the Minzu Hotel or something, the reactions would have been much worse. And today, just to finish off, John Pomfret or Scott Savitt would have immediately taken out his cell phone and shot film of what happened, and they wouldn't have had to anyway because there would have been 30,000 or 3 million ordinary Chinese citizens who would have shot that. And that is the particular fear of the Chinese regime, I think, today, that the reporting could not in any way be controlled even as much as it was that night. And in fact, an incident in Tibet or backwoods, somewhere back in backwoods China, could immediately end up on TV by virtue of cell phones. Hence, there's a need for greater control even now than there was then. Let me hold up now because I'm sure that there are lots of questions.